I just want to start off by saying, if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios in the year of 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't. But it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view new episodes days before they aired. I'll get right into it without giving too much unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat snapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up a season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and two other interns were in the editing room along with the lead animator and sound editors for the final cut. We received a copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up mock title cards, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles, such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Beehive, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles. So, we saw the title card, Squidward Suicide. We didn't think it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh. The happy-go-lucky music plays as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes back to see Sandy with Patrick. The bubbles splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point, sound synced up with animation, so yes, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that is common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward is in full frame and looks visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd with SpongeBob in center frame. He too is booing, very much unlike him. That isn't the oddest thing though. What is odd is everyone has hyper-realistic eyes, very detailed. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more than CGI. The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children yet. The shot goes to Squidward, sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view is out of a porthole window of the night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part is, at this point, there is no sound. Literally no sound. Not even feedback from a speaker in the room. As if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking in the silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob softly. He put his hands over his eyes and cried quietly for a full minute more. And while the sound in the background was very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible, it sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly began to zoom in on his face. By slow, I meant it's only noticeable if you look at the shots at 10 seconds apart side by side. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt. The screen is twitching a bit, as if it twists in on itself, for a split second, and then back to normal. The wind through the trees sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part of the sound and Squidward sobbing sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes the sound was coming through from the other side. As good as the sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of winding and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame was replaced. This led the animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He could not have been more than 6. The face was mangled and bloodied. One eye dangling over his upturned face, popped. He was naked down to his underwear, his stomach crudely cut open, his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers. The angle was completely off for a shot designated to be evidence. It would seem the photographer was a person responsible for the child's death. We, of course, mortified, but pressed on, hoping that this was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, and only half body in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in hyper-realistic style, looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if there was a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches, the laughing, deep and baritone, lasting in longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twitched and showed a single photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but we knew we had to. This time, the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was lying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was too popped out and popped, naked except for her underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, her body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in size and shape to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like it was when the scene started. Put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done in hyper-realism, like the others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen, as if he was watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and most fear-inducing of all is his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears of blood were dripping down from his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back. So did the deep laughing. This time, the still photo lasted a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and back up. This time, the photo was of a boy, about the same age, but this time, the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out of the stomach wound by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next, same thing. He went back to the first and played them quicker, and I lost it. I vomited on the floor. The animating and the sound editors gasped at the scene. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They played out as they were frames from a video. We saw a hand slowly lift guts. We saw the kid's eyes focused on it. We even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within about 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once a few frames were shown, all screaming, all sounds again stopped. Squidward just stared at the viewer, full frame of the face, about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and a deep voice said, "Do it!" and we see Squidward hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatters on the wall behind him and his bed, and he flies back with force. The last 5 seconds of the episode show his body on the bed, one on his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg, obviously angry at this, he demanded to know what the heck was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind and cause me horrible nightmares. I'm so sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called to analyze what happened. The analysis of the file did show it was edited by new material. However, the timestamp on it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as all glitches, as if the timestamp may have been a glitch and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photo, but nothing came of it. No child seen was identified, and no clues were gathered from the data involving, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I have something happen and can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things.